Ever thought lighting a room was as easy as flipping a switch? Not in the Middle Ages. Imagine toiling for hours with animal fat, foul smells thick in the air, and your hands blistered from the heat. Tonight, we step into the dim world of a medieval candle maker, a profession far less peaceful than the glow it gave off. Let's wander into the flickering light of the past, where sleep was a luxury and making it possible was pure struggle. If stories of quiet suffering, ancient routines, and forgotten professions help you drift off into peaceful dreams, you're exactly where you need to be, dust. Hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss a gentle journey through time. Before we continue, I'd love to know where are you listening from and what time is it for you? It's always amazing to see how far our quiet little stories are reaching. The first thing that would assault your senses as a medieval candle maker wasn't the harsh clang of the morning bell, nor the bitter cold seeping through the gaps in your workshop walls. It was the smell, that pervasive, nauseating odor of rendering animal fat that clung to your clothes, your hair, your very skin like a second shadow. You learned to live with it, of course, because you had no choice. But visitors to your workshop in Cheapside would often cover their noses with cloth, their faces contorting in disgust as they hurried past your storefront. Medieval Chronicles tells us that your day began before dawn, when London's narrow streets were still cloaked in darkness. The workshop that served as both your livelihood and your curse occupied the ground floor of a timber-framed building, its small windows barely allowing enough light to work by even at midday. Above, your families slept fitfully if they slept at all. The acrid smoke from your rendering process had a way of seeping through the floorboards, creating an atmosphere that modern people would find utterly unbearable. You shared this cramped quarter of Cheapside with other craftsmen whose trades were equally essential and equally malodorous. Tallow chandlers worked alongside butchers who supplied the raw material for your craft, their blood-stained aprons and cleaver-scarred hands, telling stories of daily violence against flesh that would become your livelihood. The symbiotic relationship was as old as the city itself. They provided the tallow. You transformed it into light. Your tools were simple but effective. Iron cauldrons blackened from years of use. Wooden ladles smoothed by countless hands. Hanging racks that stretched across your workshop like the ribs of some enormous beast. The wick-making materials lay in carefully organized piles, strands of hemp, cotton when you could afford it, and the precious linen that created the finest wicks for your most discerning customers. But the heart of your operation was the great rendering pot, an iron vessel that dominated your workspace like an altar to the god of illumination. The process began with the collection of tallow from local butchers. According to historical records, this was often a contentious negotiation. Butchers sometimes tried to pass off inferior fat mixed with other substances, butter when they were feeling generous, pig fat when they thought they could get away with it, or in the worst cases, actual animal entrails that would ruin an entire batch. You developed an eye for quality that could spot adulteration from across the market square, but even experienced chandlers sometimes found themselves the victims of unscrupulous suppliers. The rendering process itself was both art and endurance test. You built your fire carefully, maintaining just the right temperature to melt the fat without burning it too hot, and the tallow would become acrid and smoky when burned as candles. Too cool, and the rendering would take far too long, wasting precious fuel and daylight. The fat melted slowly, bubbling and spitting as moisture escaped, filling your workshop with clouds of greasy vapor that made breathing difficult and vision hazy. As the morning progressed, the city around you came to life with its familiar symphony of commerce and complaint. Street vendors cried their wares, horses' hooves clattered on cobblestones, and the great church bells marked the passage of time for those fortunate enough to live by the rhythms of prayer rather than the demands of flame. But inside your workshop, time moved differently. Each batch of tallow required constant attention, and a moment's inattention could ruin hours of work. The social position of a tallow chandler in medieval London was paradoxical. Medieval Britain describes candle making as providing only a modest income, yet your products were absolutely essential to daily life. Without candles, the wealthy could not illuminate their grand halls after sunset. Without candles, the poor could not extend their productive hours beyond daylight. Without candles, churches could not hold evening services, scholars could not study by night, and the very fabric of medieval society would begin to unravel. Yet despite this crucial role, you found yourself among the trades that were merely tolerated, rather than celebrated. The wealthy bought your candles but preferred not to think about their origins. The poor needed your cheaper tallow candles but resented their cost. You occupied a strange middle ground, essential yet unwanted, skilled yet scorned, prosperous enough to avoid starvation, but never wealthy enough to escape the daily grind of your malodorous trade. The apprentices who worked alongside you, typically boys in their teens who had committed to 7 years of training, learned quickly that this was not a profession for the squeamish. Guild records show that apprenticeships in candle making lasted around 7 years, during which time these young men worked upwards of 16 hours a day, their hands growing rough from handling hot wax, and their lungs adapting to the constant presence of fatty smoke. The workshop itself reflected the nature of your trade. Wooden racks lined the walls, designed to hold dozens of candles as they cooled and hardened. The floor was often slick with spilled tallow, creating a hazardous working environment where a slip could result in serious burns from the rendering pot. Ventilation was minimal, a few small windows and perhaps a hole in the roof, because glass was expensive and larger openings would let in too much rain and wind. Your day was governed by the availability of natural light and the rhythms of supply and demand. Morning brought the collection of tallow from butchers, afternoon the rendering and first dipping of wicks, and evening the repetitive process of building up each candle layer by layer. The work was simultaneously monotonous and demanding, requiring the kind of focused attention that left little room for contemplation of anything beyond the immediate task at hand. But perhaps most telling of all was how your profession shaped your relationship with the city itself. Historical accounts reveal that tallow chandlers were frequently moved around London due to complaints about the stench of their operations. You were essential to the city's function, yet unwelcome in its better neighborhoods. This constant tension between necessity and rejection would define not just your daily experience, but your entire worldview as someone whose livelihood depended on providing something everyone needed, but no one wanted to acknowledge. What kind of person, you might wonder, chose such a life? What circumstances led someone to embrace a trade that promised modest income, social isolation, and daily exposure to conditions that would challenge the strongest constitution? These questions hung in the smoky air of your workshop like the persistent smell of rendered fat, unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. By midday, when the sun reached its weak peak through London's perpetual haze of smoke and soot, your workshop had transformed into something resembling a scene from the underworld. The rendering process was in full swing now, and the great iron cauldron bubbled with melted tallow, its surface occasionally breaking with pockets of trapped air that released fresh waves of stench into the already saturated atmosphere. You had learned to breathe through your mouth during the worst of it, but even that small mercy came with its own price. The taste of rendered fat coating your tongue and throat, a flavor that would linger long after the day's work was done. The physical demands of your trade extended far beyond simple endurance of unpleasant smells. According to detailed historical accounts, the candle-making process required you to repeatedly dip prepared wicks into molten tallow, then hang them to cool and harden before dipping again. This cycle might be repeated 20 or 30 times for a single candle, and you produced dozens of candles each day. Your arms ached from the constant lifting and dipping motion, your back complained from bending over the cauldron, and your hands, despite growing calloused over years of practice, still bore the small burns and cuts that marked you as clearly as any guild badge. The temperature regulation of your molten tallow was perhaps the most crucial skill you possessed, yet it remained frustratingly imprecise. Too hot, and the previous layers of wax would melt away as you dipped, leaving you with misshapen candles that burned poorly and reflected badly on your craftsmanship. Too cool, and the new layer wouldn't adhere properly, creating candles that would separate or crack during use. You judged the temperature by experience, the color of the liquid, the way steam rose from its surface, the sound it made when disturbed by your ladle. These were skills that took years to develop and could be ruined by a moment's inattention. The economic realities of your profession weighed heavily on every decision you made throughout the day. Medieval price records show that tallow candles sold for approximately 1.5 to 2.5 pence per pound, while a skilled laborer earned about 3 pence per day. This meant that a pound of your candles represented between half and 3/4 of a day's wages for your typical customer, a significant expense that made every candle a considered purchase. For you, this translated into thin profit margins that left little room for waste or error. The relationship between chandlers and their suppliers was one of constant negotiation and suspicion. Guild ordinances reveal numerous complaints about adulterated tallow, with butchers sometimes mixing in cheaper fats or even non-fat substances to increase their profits. You develop techniques for testing tallow quality, sniffing for the telltale odors of pork fat or rancid butter, examining the color and consistency, even tasting small samples despite the unpleasantness. A bad batch of tallow could ruin a days of work and cost you customers who demanded refunds or, worse, spread word of your inferior products throughout the city. The social dynamics within your workshop reflected the broader hierarchies of medieval society, but with the peculiar twist that came from working in an essential yet stigmatized trade. Your apprentices, bound to you for 7 years of training, occupied the lowest rung of an already low-status profession. They performed the most unpleasant tasks, cleaning the rendering equipment, hauling buckets of raw tallow, maintaining the fires that heated your cauldrons. Yet they also represented your investment in the future, and their training was taken seriously despite the harsh conditions. The master-apprentice relationship in chandlery was complicated by the intimate nature of the working conditions. Unlike blacksmiths or carpenters, who worked in larger spaces where apprentices could maintain some distance from their masters, your workshop was cramped and filled with hazardous equipment. This forced a kind of proximity that bred either deep loyalty or bitter resentment. Apprentices who couldn't adapt to the smell, the heat, and the constant risk of burns often ran away, forfeiting their indentures and facing legal consequences. Rather than completing their training, the daily rhythm of production was dictated by both practical necessities and market demands. Morning hours were devoted to rendering fresh tallow and preparing wicks. The midday period, when natural light was strongest, was used for the precise work of dipping and shaping candles. Afternoon brought the tasks of trimming finished candles, sorting them by quality, and preparing them for sale. Evening was often spent on maintenance, cleaning equipment, repairing tools, and planning the next day's production based on available materials and outstanding orders. Your relationship with customers was perhaps the most psychologically challenging aspect of the trade. The wealthy could afford beeswax candles from the more prestigious wax chandlers, leaving you to serve a clientele that consisted largely of the urban poor, small merchants, and institutions that needed large quantities of cheaper illumination. These customers were price-sensitive and quality-conscious in ways that created constant pressure. They needed your candles but resented their cost. They demanded reliability but suspected you of cutting corners. They relied on your expertise but questioned every aspect of your craft. The seasonal nature of demand created its own set of challenges. Winter brought increased sales as darkness claimed more hours of each day, but it also brought increased costs as fuel for your fires became more expensive. Summer offered longer working hours and lower heating costs, but demand dropped as people relied more heavily on natural light. This cycle required careful financial planning that was complicated by the irregular nature of your income and the constant need to purchase raw materials before you could sell finished products. The health effects of your profession were beginning to manifest in ways that you tried not to think about too carefully. The constant exposure to smoke and fatty vapors left you with a persistent cough that worsened during the winter months. Your eyes, irritated by the fumes, watered frequently and had begun to show a chronic redness that marked you as clearly as a scarlet letter. The skin on your hands and forearms, repeatedly exposed to hot tallow and cleaning alkalis, had grown thick and discolored. These were the marks of your trade, badges of honor to some, signs of degradation to others. The psychological toll of working in isolation from respectable society was perhaps harder to measure, but no less real. Your workshop was avoided by all but the most desperate customers, and even they conducted their business quickly and with obvious distaste. You found companionship mainly among other chandlers and related tradesmen, butchers, tanners, dyers, whose work similarly marked them as necessary but undesirable. This created a kind of parallel society within the city, a network of people who understood each other's struggles but remained forever on the margins of medieval social life. Yet despite all these hardships, there was a certain pride in mastering such a difficult craft. A well-made tallow candle, properly rendered and carefully dipped, would burn cleanly and steadily for hours. The skill required to produce consistent quality with such basic materials was considerable, and you took satisfaction in work well done even when no one else acknowledged your expertise. This internal source of validation became crucial to maintaining your sanity in a profession that offered little external recognition or reward. As the afternoon shadows began to lengthen across your workshop floor, signaling the approach of another evening of labor, you might have paused to consider the strange ironies of your position. You created light, yet worked in perpetual shadow. You served the community's most basic needs, yet remained isolated from community life. You possessed skills that took years to master, yet practiced them in conditions that most people would consider unbearable. These contradictions defined not just your working life, but your entire existence as a medieval tallow chandler. What sustained you through these daily trials? What hopes or dreams could flourish in such unpromising soil? These questions would follow you into the evening hours when the real work of candle-making began in earnest. As twilight descended upon medieval London, your workshop took on an almost hellish appearance that would have been immediately recognizable to anyone familiar with the period's countless depictions of purgatory. The great rendering cauldron glowed like a malevolent eye in the gathering darkness, its molten contents reflecting the flickering flames beneath in patterns that seemed to writhe with their own malicious life. This was when the true labor of chandlery began, the methodical, repetitive process of transforming liquid fat into the solid cylinders of tallow that would light London's nights. The evening shift marked the beginning of your most intensive work period. Historical documentation indicates that chandlers routinely worked 16-hour days, with the evening hours devoted to the actual manufacture of candles. You had spent the day preparing materials and rendering tallow. Now came the skilled work of dipping, cooling, and building up each candle layer by layer until it reached the proper thickness and shape. The dipping process itself was a meditation in monotony that demanded both physical endurance and mental precision. You grasped a bundle of prepared wicks, typically cotton or hemp strands, cut to exact lengths and attached to a wooden rod for easier handling, and lowered them into the molten tallow. The timing was crucial. Too quick, and the wax wouldn't adhere properly. Too slow, and the heat would melt away previous layers. You lifted the wick smoothly, allowing excess tallow to drip back into the cauldron, then hung the bundle on one of the many wooden racks that lined your workshop walls. While that first coat cooled and hardened, you moved to another set of wicks, beginning the same process again. By the time you completed a circuit of all your dipping stations, the first bundle would be ready for its second coat. This cycle continued throughout the evening, each candle gradually growing thicker and more substantial. A single tallow candle might require 20 to 30 individual dippings, and you produced dozens of candles each night. The mathematics of repetition was staggering: thousands of individual dipping motions each week, tens of thousands each month. The physical toll of this work was cumulative and unforgiving. Your shoulders ached from the constant lifting and lowering motions. Your lower back cramped from bending over the cauldron hundreds of times each evening. The heat from the rendering fire, necessary to keep the tallow molten, created a working environment that fluctuated between uncomfortably warm and dangerously hot. In winter, the contrast between the blazing workshop and the freezing city outside meant that leaving your workspace, even briefly, could result in shock that left you disoriented and shivering. The quality control aspects of evening production required a level of attention that was difficult to maintain under such physically demanding conditions. Each candle had to meet certain standards of straightness, thickness, and surface smoothness. Crooked candles would burn unevenly and drip excessively. Thin candles would burn too quickly, cheating customers of the illumination they had paid for. Rough or irregular surfaces indicated poor technique and reflected badly on your reputation. You examined each candle multiple times during the dipping process, making adjustments and corrections that added time to an already lengthy procedure. The workshop environment during evening production was uniquely challenging. The combination of open flames, molten fat, and wooden structures created fire hazards that required constant vigilance. Historical records from later periods document numerous fires caused by candle-making operations, and medieval workshops faced even greater risks due to their construction methods and lack of safety regulations. A single spilled cauldron of molten tallow could ignite an entire building, and the narrow streets of medieval London meant that fires spread quickly from structure to structure. The apprentices who worked alongside you during these evening hours experienced the trade at its most demanding. They maintained the fires that kept your tallow molten, hauled fresh supplies of fat from storage areas, and performed the countless small tasks that kept production moving smoothly. Their working conditions were even worse than yours. Closer to the heat sources, handling the dirtiest equipment, breathing air that was thicker with smoke and vapors. Yet this was considered essential training, and apprentices who couldn't endure these conditions were deemed unsuitable for advancement in the craft. The economic pressures of evening production created their own form of stress. Every hour of work represented both costs and potential income, but the relationship between effort and profit was far from linear. A botched batch of candles meant lost materials, wasted time, and reduced income. Equipment failures, a cracked cauldron, a broken dipping rod, a damaged wick, could shut down production for hours or even days. The thin profit margins of the tallow trade meant that even small setbacks could threaten your family's financial. Security and customer demands added another layer of complexity to evening work. Different customers required different types of candles, thicker ones for wealthy households that could afford longer burning times, thinner ones for poor families who needed to stretch their lighting budgets, specialty shapes for religious ceremonies or particular uses. Managing these varied requirements while maintaining production efficiency required a kind of industrial choreography that took years to master. The social isolation of evening work was perhaps its most psychologically challenging aspect. While the rest of London settled into evening routines, family dinners, tavern visits, social gatherings, you remained trapped in your workshop, engaged in labor that was simultaneously essential and invisible. The city's evening sounds filtered through your small windows, laughter from nearby alehouses, the calls of night watchmen, the distant chanting from churches holding evening services. But you could only listen, never participate. The technical challenges of maintaining consistent tallow temperature throughout the evening shift required solutions that were both ingenious and labor-intensive. You learned to judge the heat by the sound of the bubbling fat, the color of the smoke rising from the cauldron, the way the liquid moved when stirred. Small adjustments to the fire required constant attention, and the fuel costs of maintaining proper temperatures throughout long evening shifts represented a significant portion of your operating expenses. The relationship between individual craftsmanship and mass production created tension that defined your evening work. Each candle was made by hand, shaped by your personal skill and attention to detail. Yet the economic demands of the trade required you to produce dozens of candles each night, creating pressure to work faster and more efficiently. This tension between quality and quantity was never fully resolved. It simply became another aspect of the trade that you learned to manage without ever truly mastering. By the time evening deepened into night, your workshop had become a self-contained world of flame, smoke, and repetitive motion. The city outside might as well have been on another continent for all the connection you felt to its rhythms and concerns. You existed in a bubble of molten tallow and growing candles, sustained by the knowledge that every dipping motion brought you marginally closer to completing the day's production goals. Yet even as exhaustion began to cloud your thoughts and your movements became increasingly automatic, there remained the constant awareness that tomorrow would bring another day exactly like this one. The same early morning trip to collect tallow from suspicious butchers, the same hours of rendering and preparation, the same evening of endless dipping and cooling. This was not a temporary hardship to be endured, but the permanent pattern of your adult life stretching out into an indefinite future. The question that haunted your evening hours was not whether you could continue this work. Economic necessity made that choice for you. But whether the trade that defined your existence might somehow, someday, offer possibilities beyond the grinding repetition of daily survival. The year 1371 marked a turning point in the history of medieval candlemaking, though not for reasons that would have been immediately apparent to the casual observer walking through London's commercial districts. Behind the familiar scenes of workshops filled with bubbling tallow and the eternal dance of dipping and cooling, a different kind of drama was unfolding, one that would determine not just how candles were made, but who had the right to make them, sell them, and profit from humanity's ancient struggle against darkness. The Wax Chandler Ordinances of 1371 represent one of the most detailed surviving documents of medieval guild regulation, offering us an unprecedented glimpse into how these powerful organizations controlled every aspect of their members' professional lives. On November 13th of that year, a group of Londoners engaged in making and selling wax candles and sealing wax formally petitioned the city authorities for the right to organize themselves into a self-governing body. Their request was not unusual. Between 1322 and 1396, no less than 37 craft companies brought similar ordinances for self-government, but the specific terms they negotiated reveal the intricate machinery of medieval economic control. The Warnow petitioners claimed that their craft had been evil-ruled and governed afore this time, a diplomatically phrased admission that the candle trade had been operating in a state of barely controlled chaos. Quality was inconsistent, prices fluctuated wildly, and competition had devolved into a race to the bottom that threatened the livelihoods of honest craftsmen while flooding the market with inferior products. The solution they proposed was characteristically medieval in its approach, the creation of a formal hierarchy with the power to impose order through regulation, punishment, and exclusion. The first ordinance established the appointment of masters from among their number, officials who would oversee all the defaults in their said craft and see that offenders were prosecuted. This seemingly simple administrative step represented a profound shift in how the trade operated. Previously, candle makers had competed as individuals with market forces and personal reputation serving as the primary regulators of quality and behavior. Now a small group of elected masters would hold the power to determine who could practice the craft, how it should be practiced, and what consequences would befall those who violated the newly established standards. The specific regulations they imposed revealed the day-to-day realities that had driven them to seek guild status. The ordinances fixed precise charges for funeral and ceremonial candles, 9d per pound of wax for the hire of candles and their iron stands, with reduced rates of a halfpenny per pound when customers supplied their own raw materials. These weren't arbitrary numbers, they represented carefully calculated prices that would ensure guild members could earn a sustainable living while preventing the kind of price cutting that had threatened the trade's stability. The variety of candle types specified in the ordinances, tapers, torches, square funeral candles, coureurs, torchettes, briquettes, and perches, illustrates the sophisticated market that had developed around illumination and ceremony. Each type required different skills, materials, and time investments, and the guild's pricing structure had to account for these variations while maintaining competitive relationships with other trades. The funeral candle market, in particular, represented a lucrative niche that required both technical expertise and diplomatic skills in dealing with grieving families and religious institutions. Perhaps most significantly, the ordinances required every city chandler to have his own identifying mark, which was to be stamped on all wax items. This requirement for makers' marks represented both quality control and market accountability in ways that foreshadowed modern concepts of branding and product liability. A chandler whose marked candles burned poorly or failed to meet specifications could be held directly accountable, while those who consistently produced superior products could build reputations that commanded premium prices. The guild system's approach to dealing with inferior workmanship was both public and punitive in ways that reflected medieval attitudes towards shame and social control. A chandler found guilty of dealing in adulterated wax faced escalating penalties, fines of 6 shillings 8 pence for the first offence, 13 shillings 4 pence for the second, and 20 shillings for the third. But the punishment went beyond mere financial penalties. The offender would have the mayor's heavies come and make a fire of the substandard wares on his doorstep, a public destruction of inferior goods that served both as punishment and advertisement of the guild's commitment to quality standards. The ultimate sanction, permanent banishment from the craft upon a fourth offence, represented a form of economic death sentence in a society where professional identity was closely tied to survival. A master chandler who forswore the craft forevermore faced not just the loss of his current livelihood, but exclusion from the only trade he knew how to practice. This severity of punishment reflects both the guild's determination to maintain standards and the broader medieval belief that repeated violations of community norms justified complete social exclusion. The relationship between the wax chandlers and their tallow-working counterparts was complex and sometimes contentious. While both trades dealt with candle making, the social and economic distinctions between them were significant. Wax chandlers worked with expensive beeswax imported from various parts of Europe, serving wealthy customers who could afford the superior burning qualities and pleasant scent of beeswax candles. Tallow chandlers, meanwhile, rendered animal fat from local butchers to serve the mass market for everyday illumination. These distinctions created natural tensions over market boundaries and social status. Wax chandlers could claim higher social standing due to their more expensive materials and wealthier clientele, but tallow chandlers probably enjoyed more stable income due to the steady demand for their products among the urban poor and middle classes. The guild system helped manage these tensions by creating separate organizational structures for each trade, while the city government ensured that both crafts had defined roles in London's economic ecosystem. The apprenticeship system administered by the guild created its own social dynamics that extended far beyond simple job training. Medieval apprenticeships typically lasted 7 years, during which time young men were bound not just to learn technical skills, but to absorb the social norms and economic relationships that defined their craft. For wax chandlers, this meant learning to deal with expensive materials, wealthy customers, and the political complexities of guild membership. The guild's role in regulating apprenticeship created opportunities for both advancement and exploitation. Master chandlers gained access to unpaid labor in exchange for providing training, but they also assumed legal and financial responsibility for their apprentices' behavior and development. The guild monitored these relationships to prevent the worst abuses, but the system was inherently unbalanced in favor of established masters who controlled access to the skills and connections needed for professional success. The political dimensions of guild membership extended far beyond the narrow concerns of candle making. In London, the wealthiest craft guilds became powerful political players, influencing city policy and participating in the complex networks of patronage and obligation that characterized medieval urban governance. While wax chandlers never achieved the political prominence of merchants or goldsmiths, their guild membership provided access to influence and protection that was unavailable to unorganized craftsmen. The economic benefits of guild membership came with corresponding obligations that shaped every aspect of a chandler's professional life. Members gained access to regulated markets, protection from unfair competition, and collective bargaining power in negotiations with suppliers and customers. But they also submitted to guild authority in matters of pricing, quality standards, working methods, and even personal behavior. The guild could fine, suspend, or expel members who violated its rules, effectively controlling their economic survival. The fees and assessments required for guild membership created their own economic pressures. New members paid admission fees, all members contributed to guild expenses, and various special assessments funded everything from charitable activities to political lobbying. For a trade that provided only modest income, these financial obligations could represent a significant burden, yet the alternative, practicing outside the guild system, was typically even more economically precarious. The guild's relationship with city authorities reflected the broader patterns of medieval urban governance, where economic regulation was seen as essential to maintaining social order. The city granted guilds their charters and legal authority, but it also monitored their activities to ensure they served broader public interests, rather than just their members' narrow concerns. This created a complex dance of cooperation and tension that required political skills alongside technical expertise. As the 14th century progressed and the guild system matured, the initial problems that had driven the wax chandlers to seek organization began to give way to new challenges. Success in regulating their own trade brought increased scrutiny from city authorities, competition from other guilds seeking to expand their territories, and internal tensions as prosperity created new divisions between wealthy masters and struggling journeymen. The very solutions that had saved the craft from chaos were generating their own forms of conflict and complexity. What had begun as a simple desire for better rule and governance was evolving into something far more elaborate and potentially constraining. The practical implementation of guild authority in 14th century London revealed itself most clearly in the daily interactions between masters, journeymen, and apprentices within the tightly regulated world of wax chandlery. What had appeared on parchment as reasonable administrative procedures translated into a complex web of surveillance, judgment, and enforcement that touched every aspect of a chandler's working life. The guildmasters, elected annually from among the most established members, wielded powers that would seem extraordinary to modern eyes. They could inspect workshops without warning, confiscate materials deemed substandard, impose fines that could bankrupt smaller operations, and ultimately determine who could earn a living in their trade. The system of quality control established by the guild ordinances required a level of standardization that was revolutionary for its time. Every chandler was required to use his personal identifying mark on all products, creating an early form of product liability that made individual craftsmen directly accountable for their work's performance. This marking system meant that a candle that burned poorly, dripped excessively, or failed to provide the expected hours of illumination could be traced back to its maker, who would then face guild investigation and potential punishment. The guildmasters conducted regular inspections of workshops and finished products, armed with the authority to confiscate any items that failed to meet established standards. These inspections were not mere formalities. The ordinances specified that offending items would be publicly burned, creating a spectacle that served both as punishment for the offender and warning to other guild members. The sight of a master's work going up in flames on his own doorstep was a powerful deterrent that reinforced the guild's commitment to maintaining quality standards. The economic implications of this enforcement system extended far beyond the immediate costs of confiscated goods. A chandler who gained a reputation for producing inferior work would find his customer base eroding as word spread through London's tight-knit commercial community. The guild's marking system ensured that poor workmanship could not be hidden behind anonymity, while the public nature of punishments guaranteed that violations would become common knowledge. This created powerful incentives for self-regulation, as most chandlers understood that maintaining their professional reputation was essential to long-term survival. The relationship between guild members and their suppliers became increasingly formalized as the organization's power grew. The persistent problem of adulterated wax, https://www.waxchandlers.org.uk, about wax chandler ordinances of 1771, wax mixed with cheaper substances like tallow, resin, or even animal fats, led the guild to develop sophisticated testing procedures that members were expected to master and apply. These tests went beyond simple visual inspection to include assessments of smell, texture, melting point, and burning characteristics that required considerable expertise to perform accurately. The Guild's authority over pricing represented, perhaps, its most direct intervention in members' economic lives. The fixed rates established for funeral and ceremonial candles, 9 pence per pound for complete service, or a halfpenny per pound when customers provided their own wax, eliminated the price competition that had previously driven some chandlers to bankruptcy while flooding the market with substandard products. This price standardization created predictable income streams for guild members, but it also meant that individual chandlers could no longer use pricing strategies to differentiate themselves from competitors. The apprenticeship system administered by the guild created its own elaborate hierarchy of obligations and privileges that extended far beyond the workshop floor. Master chandlers gained the right to train apprentices, but they also assumed legal responsibility for their behavior, both within and outside the workplace. Guild records show that masters could be fined for their apprentices' misconduct, creating powerful incentives for careful selection and close supervision of young workers. The 7-year apprenticeship period represented a significant investment for both parties. Masters provided training, food, lodging, and basic education, while apprentices contributed their labor and committed to learning skills that would determine their adult livelihoods. The Guild's role in regulating working hours and conditions reflected both practical concerns about product quality and broader social attitudes about proper conduct. Chandlers were expected to maintain workshops that met Guild standards for cleanliness and organization, not just for aesthetic reasons, but because disorderly conditions were believed to contribute to poor workmanship. The Guild could order improvements to workshops, specify the types of equipment that members should use, and even dictate the methods by which certain products should be manufactured. The social dimensions of Guild membership created networks of mutual obligation that extended far beyond professional relationships. Guild members were expected to support each other during times of personal crisis, contribute to collective charitable activities, and participate in the ceremonial functions that reinforced their shared identity. The Guild maintained a common fund that provided assistance to members' widows and orphans, offered support during periods of illness or injury, and financed the elaborate processions and feasts that demonstrated the organization's wealth and solidarity to the broader community. The Guild's relationship with religious institutions added another layer of complexity to its operations. Many guilds maintained close ties with specific churches or religious orders, contributing to building projects, endowing masses for deceased members, and participating in religious festivals that served both spiritual and commercial purposes. For wax chandlers, these religious connections were particularly important because churches represented major customers for ceremonial candles and because the Guild's charitable activities were often organized around religious themes. The political dimensions of Guild membership became increasingly important as the organization's influence grew. Guild masters often served in city government, participated in trade delegations, and represented their members' interests in negotiations with other guilds and municipal authorities. This political activity required skills that went far beyond candle making, diplomacy, legal knowledge, and the ability to navigate complex networks of urban politics. Successful guild leaders often found themselves wielding influence that extended far beyond their original trade. The guild's enforcement mechanisms relied heavily on social pressure and economic sanctions rather than physical punishment. A member who violated guild rules might find himself excluded from collective purchasing arrangements, denied access to the best raw materials, or simply ignored by fellow guild members who controlled access to customers and business opportunities. This social ostracism could be more effective than formal legal penalties because it threatened the personal relationships that made professional success possible in medieval London's close-knit commercial community. The appeals process established by the guild ordinances provided some protection against arbitrary punishment, but it also created opportunities for political maneuvering and favoritism. Members who felt they had been unjustly sanctioned could petition the guild leadership for reconsideration, but the success of such appeals often depended more on personal relationships and political alliances than on the merits of the case. This system could protect well-connected members while leaving outsiders vulnerable to harsh treatment. The guild's authority over technological innovation created tensions between tradition and progress that would intensify as the medieval period drew to a close. New techniques for candle making, improved materials, or innovative products had to be approved by guild leadership before members could adopt them. This regulatory approach helped maintain quality standards and prevented members from being forced into expensive equipment upgrades, but it also slowed the adoption of improvements that might have made the trade more efficient or profitable. The financial obligations of guild membership created ongoing pressure that affected every aspect of a chandler's business planning. Beyond the initial admission fees and regular dues, members faced assessments for special projects, contributions to charitable funds, and the costs of participating in guild ceremonies and political activities. For a trade that provided only modest income, these financial demands could represent a significant burden that required careful budgeting and forced difficult choices between guild obligations and family needs. The guild's control over market access gave it power to make or break individual members' economic prospects. Chandlers who fell out of favor with guild leadership might find themselves assigned to less desirable market stalls, excluded from lucrative contracts with wealthy customers, or subjected to more frequent and harsh inspections than their peers. This created powerful incentives for political conformity and personal loyalty that went far beyond mere compliance with technical standards. The documentation requirements imposed by the guild created an early form of business record-keeping that was revolutionary for its time. Members were expected to maintain records of their purchases, sales, and production that could be audited by guild officials. These records served multiple purposes. They provided evidence for quality control investigations, helped establish market prices for raw materials, and created the documentation needed to resolve disputes between members or between the guild and outside parties. As the guild system matured and became more elaborate, the very mechanisms designed to protect members' interests began to create new forms of constraint and competition. The standardization that had eliminated destructive price competition also limited members' ability to innovate or adapt to changing market conditions. The social bonds that provided security and mutual support also created obligations that could be financially and personally burdensome. The political influence that protected the trade from outside interference also generated internal conflicts over leadership and policy that could be as damaging as external threats. The success of the guild system in achieving its original goals, stable prices, consistent quality, and professional solidarity, was creating new challenges that would test the organization's ability to adapt to changing circumstances. What had begun as a solution to the problems of an unregulated trade was evolving into a complex institution with its own internal dynamics and contradictions. By the dawn of the 15th century, the guild system that had promised salvation to London's struggling chandlers had evolved into something far more complex and potentially constraining than its founders had envisioned. The very success of the Wax Chandlers organization in establishing market control and professional standards had created new forms of internal hierarchy and external pressure that transformed membership from a simple professional association into a lifelong commitment with profound social, economic, and political implications. The financial burden of guild membership had grown substantially beyond the modest fees originally envisioned in the 1371 ordinances. Guild records from later periods reveal a complex structure of dues, assessments, and obligations that could consume a significant portion of a working chandler's income. New members paid substantial admission fees that varied based on their background. Those born to existing guild families paid less than outsiders, while apprentices who had completed their training locally faced lower costs than masters seeking to transfer from other cities or trades. The annual dues required to maintain membership were supplemented by frequent special assessments for guild projects, charitable activities, and political lobbying. The guild maintained elaborate headquarters, funded religious observances, supported members' widows and orphans, and increasingly engaged in the expensive business of urban politics. These costs were distributed among the membership according to formulas that theoretically reflected each member's ability to pay, but in practice often fell most heavily on mid-level masters who lacked the political influence to avoid assessment while earning enough to be considered prosperous. The social stratification within the guild had become increasingly pronounced as the organization matured. A small group of wealthy masters dominated guild leadership, controlling access to the most lucrative contracts and maintaining their positions through networks of patronage and mutual obligation. These guild aristocrats often owned multiple workshops, employed numerous journeymen and apprentices, and had diversified their activities beyond simple candle making into related trades like sealing wax production, ceremonial lighting services, and even money lending to fellow guild members. Below this elite tier, a larger group of working masters struggled to maintain their independence while meeting the increasingly demanding requirements of guild membership. These chandlers owned their own workshops and employed small numbers of assistants, but they found themselves caught between rising costs and regulated prices that limited their ability to increase profits. Many supplemented their income through side activities, trading in other commodities like herrings and butter, taking on apprentices beyond their actual training capacity, or accepting piecework from wealthier masters who had more orders than they could handle personally. The journeymen, skilled workers who had completed their apprenticeships but lacked the capital to establish independent workshops, occupied an increasingly precarious position within the guild hierarchy. The guild system theoretically provided a path from apprentice to journeyman to master, but the practical obstacles to achieving mastership had grown formidable. Establishing a workshop required substantial capital for equipment, raw materials, and premises. Guild admission fees had to be paid, and new masters needed political connections to gain access to customers and suppliers. Many journeymen found themselves trapped in a form of perpetual dependency, working for established masters, who had little incentive to help them achieve independence. The guild's pricing regulations meant that masters could not compete on price, so they competed instead on service, quality, and personal relationships, advantages that established members could maintain indefinitely over newcomers. Some journeymen spent decades working for wages that barely covered their living expenses, never accumulating the capital needed to advance to mastership. The apprenticeship system had also evolved in ways that reflected the guild's growing sophistication and social stratification. The 7-year training period remained standard, but the content and quality of training varied enormously depending on the master's status and resources. Wealthy masters could afford to provide comprehensive education that included not just technical skills but literacy, numeracy, and the social connections needed for professional success. Less prosperous masters might provide minimal training while maximizing the economic value they extracted from apprentice labor. The guild's authority over apprenticeship contracts created opportunities for both protection and exploitation. Masters were required to provide food, lodging, and training, but the guild's enforcement of these obligations was inconsistent and often influenced by the master's political standing within the organization. Apprentices who complained about inadequate treatment might find themselves blacklisted from the trade, while those who served wealthy and influential masters could expect support in establishing their own careers. The relationship between the wax chandlers and other guilds had become increasingly competitive and politically charged as London's economy grew more complex. The tallow chandlers' company served a different market segment, but competed for some of the same raw materials and customers. Jurisdictional disputes arose regularly, over which guild had the right to regulate specific products or serve particular customer categories. These conflicts often required expensive legal proceedings and political lobbying that drained resources from both organizations. The guild's relationship with city authorities had evolved from simple licensing and regulation to complex political partnerships that served both parties' interests. The city relied on guilds to maintain order within their trades, collect taxes, and provide political support for municipal policies. In return, guilds received legal protection for their monopolies, enforcement assistance for their regulations, and access to political influence that could benefit their members. This partnership created new obligations for guild leadership and new costs for guild membership. The ceremonial and social aspects of guild membership had expanded far beyond their original modest scope. Guild processions, feasts, and religious observances had become elaborate affairs that demonstrated the organization's wealth and status while reinforcing internal hierarchies and external relationships. Members were expected to participate in these activities and contribute to their costs, creating social obligations that could be as burdensome as financial ones. The guild's livery, special clothing worn during formal occasions, had to be purchased and maintained by individual members, adding another expense to the growing list of membership costs. The guild's charitable activities, originally conceived as mutual aid among members, had expanded to include broader community obligations that reflected the organization's growing prominence and political influence. The guild supported churches, contributed to civic projects, and maintained facilities for poor relief that served non-members as well as guild families. While these activities enhanced the guild's reputation and political standing, they also created ongoing financial obligations that had to be funded through member assessments. The technological and market changes beginning to emerge in the late medieval period created new challenges for guild regulation and member prosperity. Competition from other forms of lighting, changes in raw material availability, and evolving customer preferences required adaptations that the guild's conservative regulatory structure struggled to accommodate. Members who wanted to experiment with new techniques or products faced lengthy approval processes, while those who maintained traditional methods found themselves losing market share to more innovative competitors. The legal protections provided by guild membership had become both more valuable and more complex as the organization's political influence grew. Guild members could appeal to their leadership for assistance in disputes with customers, suppliers, or other tradesmen, and the guild's legal resources often proved effective in protecting members' interests. However, this protection came with the expectation that members would support the guild's positions in broader political conflicts, even when those positions might not serve their individual interests. The geographical scope of guild authority had expanded as trade networks grew more extensive and complex. Members traveling to other cities for business carried credentials that identified them as members in good standing of a recognized guild, providing access to local guild hospitality and professional networks. However, this expansion also created new obligations, as guilds were expected to monitor their members' activities in other jurisdictions and maintain reciprocal relationships with similar organizations throughout Europe. The record-keeping and administrative requirements of guild membership had grown substantially as the organization became more sophisticated and politically involved. Members were expected to maintain detailed business records, file regular reports with guild authorities, and participate in the complex bureaucratic processes that governed guild decision-making. For working chandlers whose education might be limited and whose time was consumed by the demands of their trade, these administrative burdens could be overwhelming. The internal politics of guild governance had become increasingly complex and potentially divisive as the organization's influence and resources grew. Elections for guild leadership often involved elaborate campaigns, political alliances, and competitions for influence that could create lasting divisions within the membership. Successful political participation required skills and connections. that went far beyond professional competence, creating advantages for members with aristocratic backgrounds or extensive family networks while disadvantaging those whose only qualification was mastery of their craft. The Guild's success in achieving its original goals had created a new set of problems that threatened to undermine the very benefits that membership was supposed to provide. The market stability that had saved struggling chandlers from ruinous competition now constrained successful members who wanted to expand their businesses or experiment with new approaches. The professional solidarity that had provided security and mutual support now sometimes felt like surveillance and control that limited individual freedom and creativity. As Guild members approached the end of their careers, many found themselves questioning whether the organization that had shaped their professional lives had truly served their interests or had instead created new forms of constraint and obligation that were as limiting as the original problems it had been designed to solve. This ambivalence about Guild membership would become increasingly common as the medieval period drew to a close and new economic realities began to challenge the assumptions underlying the Guild system. What had begun as a voluntary association of craftsmen seeking mutual protection and professional advancement had evolved into a complex institution with its own internal dynamics, political agendas, and economic requirements that sometimes conflicted with the interests of ordinary working members. The relationship between medieval chandlers and fire was one of intimate and perpetual danger, a daily negotiation with forces that could provide livelihood or deliver destruction with equal indifference. Every morning as you kindled the flames, beneath your rendering cauldron, you entered into a compact with an element that had no respect for your skill, your caution, or your need to earn a living. Fire was your tool, your enemy, and your master, all contained within the cramped confines of a wooden workshop in a city where buildings pressed against each other like kindling, awaiting a spark. Historical documentation of candle-related fires from later periods reveals that even with improved safety measures, candles caused thousands of fires annually, resulting in hundreds of deaths and millions in property damage. In medieval London, where safety regulations were minimal and firefighting capabilities were primitive, the dangers were exponentially greater. Your workshop, with its open flames, bubbling cauldrons of molten fat, and wooden construction, represented a constant threat not just to your own survival, but to the entire neighborhood that surrounded your livelihood. The technical challenges of maintaining proper flame temperature for tallow rendering required a level of fire management that bordered on artistry. Too low, and the fat would not melt completely, leaving impurities that would cause your candles to burn poorly and smoke excessively. Too high, and the tallow would overheat, creating acrid fumes that made breathing difficult and producing candles that burned too quickly or dripped excessively. The rendering process required you to maintain steady heat for hours at a time, a task that demanded constant vigilance and frequent adjustments to fuel and airflow. The fuel requirements of your operation created their own hazards and expenses. Wood was the primary fuel source, but not all wood burned equally well for chandlery purposes. Hardwoods burned more steadily and produced less smoke, but they were expensive and sometimes difficult to obtain. Softwoods were cheaper and more readily available, but they burned irregularly and created sparks that could ignite spilled tallow or wooden equipment. The accumulation of wood ash and embers around your fire pit created additional fire hazards that required daily cleaning and careful disposal. The physical layout of your workshop had evolved around the central imperative of fire safety, though the constraints of urban real estate and economic necessity severely limited your options. Medieval workshops were typically small, cramped spaces that combined production, storage, and retail functions within minimal square footage. Your rendering fire had to be positioned to provide adequate ventilation while remaining accessible for fuel additions and temperature adjustments. The drying racks for your candles needed to be far enough from the fire to prevent melting, but close enough to benefit from the warmth that helped the wax harden properly. The seasonal variations in fire risk created patterns of anxiety that followed the rhythm of the medieval calendar. Winter brought increased demand for candles, but also presented greater fire hazards as you worked longer hours with larger, hotter fires to meet customer needs. The cold weather that drove people to seek more illumination also made your workshop's heating system work harder, creating additional opportunities for accidents. Dry winter air increased the risk of spark ignition, while the accumulation of ash and debris from heavy fuel use created hazardous conditions that were difficult to manage in freezing temperatures. Summer presented different but equally serious challenges. The combination of hot weather and the intense heat generated by your rendering fires created working conditions that were almost unbearable. The reduced ventilation used to keep rain out of your workshop trapped heat and fumes that could cause dizziness and disorientation, increasing the likelihood of accidents around open flames. The lower humidity of summer air made wooden structures more susceptible to ignition, while the reduced demand for candles meant that economic pressures might tempt you to take shortcuts in safety procedures. The human factors that contributed to fire risk in medieval chandlery were as significant as the technical challenges. Working 16-hour days in hot, smoky conditions led to fatigue that compromised judgment and reaction time. The repetitive nature of candle dipping created opportunities for automatic behavior that might overlook developing dangers. The financial pressures of the trade encouraged working with minimal safety margins, using older equipment longer than prudent, maintaining fires at higher temperatures than ideal, or continuing work when conditions were marginal. The apprentices and journeymen who worked alongside you represented both additional labor and additional risk factors. Young apprentices, eager to prove their competence and value, sometimes took unnecessary risks around hot equipment and open flames. Their inexperience with fire management could lead to accidents that endangered everyone in the workshop. The cramped working conditions meant that one person's mistake could quickly become everyone's emergency, while the hierarchical nature of the workplace sometimes discouraged apprentices from reporting safety concerns or equipment problems. The storage of flammable materials within your workshop created ongoing fire hazards that required careful management. Raw tallow, while not as immediately flammable as dry wood or cloth, could ignite under certain conditions and burned with an intense, difficult-to-extinguish flame. The wooden racks used for drying candles accumulated wax residue over time, creating surfaces that could ignite more easily than clean wood. The hemp and cotton used for wicks were highly flammable and had to be stored away from heat sources while remaining accessible for daily production needs. The relationship between your workshop and the surrounding neighborhood was complicated by the fire risks inherent in your trade. Medieval urban construction featured buildings built close together with shared walls and minimal fire breaks between structures. A fire in your workshop could spread rapidly to neighboring buildings, destroying not just your own livelihood, but the homes and businesses of people who depended on you for lighting. This created social tensions that made your already unpopular trade even more problematic for community relations. The primitive firefighting capabilities available in medieval London meant that once a serious fire started, containment was often impossible. The city lacked organized fire departments, water pressure systems, or effective fire suppression equipment. Firefighting efforts typically involved bucket brigades that could be effective against small fires but were inadequate for major conflagrations. The narrow streets that characterized medieval urban planning made it difficult to move firefighting equipment or create effective fire breaks once a blaze was established. The legal and economic consequences of fire damage extended far beyond the immediate physical destruction. Guild regulations held masters responsible for fires that originated in their workshops, potentially leading to fines, expulsion from the guild, or legal liability for damages to neighboring properties. Insurance, in the modern sense, did not exist, so a serious fire could result in complete financial ruin that affected not just the workshop owner, but his family, employees, and creditors. The psychological impact of living and working under constant fire risk created stress patterns that affected every aspect of a chandler's daily experience. The knowledge that a moment's inattention or a stroke of bad luck could destroy everything you had worked to build created chronic anxiety that was impossible to completely suppress. Sleep was often interrupted by concerns about properly banked fires or securely stored materials. The smell of smoke from other parts of the city could trigger alarm responses that proved difficult to calm even when the danger was distant. The seasonal rhythm of fire anxiety followed patterns that were as predictable as they were unchangeable. Spring brought relief from winter's intensive fire use, but also created new challenges as increased wind and changing weather patterns affected workshop conditions. The transition periods between seasons often proved most dangerous, as established routines had to be adjusted for new conditions while maintaining production schedules that couldn't accommodate gradual adaptation. The cultural attitudes toward fire in medieval society reflected both deep respect for its power and practical acceptance of its risks. Fire was seen as a divine gift that enabled civilization, but also as a force of divine judgment that could be turned against sinful communities. Religious interpretations of fire accidents often focused on moral failings rather than technical causes, creating additional psychological pressure for craftsmen whose livelihoods required constant interaction with flames. The technical knowledge required for fire safety in medieval chandlery was largely experiential, passed down through apprenticeship systems that emphasized practical skills over theoretical understanding. Masters learned through years of experience how to read the subtle signs that indicated developing fire hazards, changes in flame color, unusual sounds from burning fuel, or variations in smoke patterns that might indicate problems with ventilation or fuel quality. This knowledge was difficult to codify or communicate systematically, creating situations where safety depended heavily on individual expertise and attention. The economic calculations that governed fire safety decisions often created conflicts between prudent caution and financial necessity. Safer practices typically required additional time, more expensive materials, or reduced production efficiency that could make the difference between profit and loss in a trade that provided only modest margins. The temptation to cut corners on safety was constant, particularly during periods of high demand or financial pressure when the immediate costs of caution seemed to outweigh the uncertain risks of accident. As darkness fell each evening and you banked your fires for the night, the question was never whether you had eliminated all fire risks, that was impossible in your trade, but whether you had managed them skillfully enough to see another dawn. The documented fire incidents that occurred in medieval chandlery workshops read like a catalogue of preventable disasters, each one a testament to the thin margin between competence and catastrophe that defined daily life in the trade. When Master Thomas Whitmore's tallow workshop burned in the winter of 1392, taking with it 3 neighbouring buildings and the lives of 2 apprentices, the subsequent guild investigation revealed a pattern of risks that were common throughout London's chandlery district. Guild records from the period document dozens of similar incidents, each one a stark reminder of the price paid for humanity's need for artificial light. The Whitmore fire began, according to witness testimony recorded in guild proceedings, when an apprentice attempting to adjust the rendering fire during the evening work period accidentally knocked over a ladle of molten tallow. The spilled fat ignited immediately upon contact with the flames, creating a pool of fire that spread across the workshop floor faster than anyone present could react. The wooden drying racks accumulated wax residue and stored raw materials. provided abundant fuel for a conflagration that quickly overwhelmed the building's minimal fire resistance. What made the Whitmore incident particularly tragic was how typical it was. Historical analysis of medieval workshop fires reveals that most began with simple accidents, spilled materials, overturned equipment, or momentary lapses in attention around open flames. The cramped conditions of urban workshops meant that small mistakes quickly became major disasters, while the primitive firefighting capabilities of the period ensured that once a fire gained momentum, containment was often impossible. The human cost of these incidents extended far beyond the immediate casualties. The two apprentices who died in the Whitmore fire were young men whose families had invested years of hope and resources in their training. Their deaths not only eliminated their potential contributions to their family's welfare, but also left their masters facing legal and financial consequences that could destroy their own livelihoods. The Guild's compensation systems provided minimal support for victims' families, while the legal liability for fire damage could bankrupt even successful masters. The economic ripple effects of workshop fires created financial devastation that extended throughout the chandlery community. When a master's workshop burned, he lost not just his building and equipment, but also his inventory of raw materials and finished products. The time required to rebuild and re-establish production meant lost income during peak seasons when demand for candles was highest. Insurance in the modern sense did not exist, so masters faced the prospect of complete financial ruin from a single, unfortunate incident. The impact on neighboring businesses created additional economic pressure that strained community relationships, already made difficult by the unpopular nature of chandlery operations. Medieval urban construction featured shared walls and minimal fire breaks between buildings, so workshop fires often destroyed multiple businesses simultaneously. The resulting legal disputes over liability and compensation could drag on for years, creating ongoing financial uncertainty for entire neighborhoods. The Guild's response to fire incidents revealed both the strengths and limitations of medieval craft organization. Guild ordinances required masters to maintain their workshops in safe condition and imposed penalties for violations that contributed to fire risk. However, the Guild's enforcement capabilities were limited, and the economic pressures that drove masters to accept dangerous conditions were often beyond the organization's ability to address. The investigation procedures developed by the Guild following major fire incidents attempted to identify causes and prevent future occurrences, but they were hampered by limited technical understanding of fire behavior and the political considerations that influenced Guild decision-making. Masters with political influence within the Guild sometimes received more lenient treatment than those with lesser standing, while the desire to maintain the trade's reputation could lead to findings that minimized chandlery's role in fire incidents. The technological limitations of medieval firefighting meant that prevention was far more important than suppression, yet the tools available for fire prevention were primitive and often ineffective. Water was scarce and difficult to transport in sufficient quantities to be useful against major fires. Sand could smother small fires but was useless against the intense heat and rapid spread characteristic of workshop conflagrations. The leather, buckets and simple tools used for firefighting were inadequate against fires involving molten tallow, which burned hotter and longer than ordinary combustibles. The seasonal patterns of fire incidents reflected the varying demands and conditions of chandlery work throughout the year. Winter brought the highest fire risks as masters worked longer hours with larger fires to meet increased demand for candles. The dry conditions and increased fuel consumption of winter months created optimal conditions for fire ignition and spread. Spring and fall transitions often proved dangerous as changing weather patterns required adjustments to workshop procedures that could create new risks. The training provided to apprentices regarding fire safety was largely informal and experiential. passed down through observation and occasional instruction from masters who themselves had learned through trial and error. The 7-year apprenticeship period provided ample time for learning fire management skills, but the quality of instruction varied enormously depending on the master's knowledge, teaching ability, and commitment to safety over production efficiency. The psychological impact of fire incidents on chandlery workers created long-lasting effects that influenced behavior throughout entire careers. Masters who had experienced serious fires often became overly cautious, implementing safety procedures that reduced productivity and profitability. Conversely, those who had been fortunate enough to avoid major incidents sometimes became complacent, ignoring risks that more experienced colleagues recognized as serious threats. The legal framework governing fire liability in medieval London was complex and often contradictory, reflecting the tension between individual responsibility and community welfare. City ordinances held workshop owners responsible for fires that originated on their premises, but proving causation was often difficult and politically charged. The penalties for fire negligence could include fines, imprisonment, or expulsion from the trade, but enforcement was inconsistent and often influenced by the social and economic status of the accused. The insurance mechanisms available to medieval chandlers were limited to informal mutual aid arrangements within guilds and religious organizations. Guild charitable funds could provide temporary assistance to fire victims, but the resources available were typically insufficient to cover major losses. Religious institutions sometimes provided support for craft workers who suffered disasters, but this aid was usually contingent on moral judgments about the recipient's worthiness and the circumstances of their loss. The impact of fire incidents on public attitudes toward chandlery created ongoing challenges for the trade's social acceptance and political standing. Each major fire reinforced public perception of chandlers as dangerous neighbors whose presence threatened community safety. The city's efforts to relocate chandlery operations to less densely populated areas reflected both practical safety concerns and social pressure from neighborhoods that wanted to exclude fire-prone industries. The competition between different chandlery trades created additional pressures that sometimes compromised fire safety. Wax chandlers and tallow chandlers often competed for the same customers and workshop locations, leading to cost-cutting measures that could include reduced investment in fire safety equipment or procedures. The economic advantages gained by masters willing to accept higher fire risks could force more cautious competitors to choose between safety and survival. The technical evolution of chandlery equipment and procedures was influenced by fire safety considerations, but progress was slow and often resisted by masters who had invested heavily in existing methods. Improvements in cauldron design, ventilation systems, and workshop layout could reduce fire risks, but they also required capital, investments that many masters could not afford. The conservative nature of guild regulation sometimes delayed the adoption of safety improvements that might have prevented injuries and property damage. The relationship between fire risk and workshop productivity created ongoing tensions that were never fully resolved. Safer practices generally required more time, more expensive equipment, or reduced output that could make the difference between profit and loss in a trade with narrow margins. Masters faced constant pressure to balance prudent caution against economic necessity, often making decisions that prioritized short-term survival over long-term safety. The cultural attitudes toward fire in medieval society influenced how chandlery accidents were interpreted and remembered. Fire was often seen as divine judgment rather than technical failure, leading to responses that focused on moral reform rather than practical prevention. This religious interpretation of fire incidents could provide comfort to victims and their families, but it also obscured the technical and economic factors that contributed to workshop accidents. As you walk through the charred remains of a colleague's workshop, examining the twisted metal and blackened timber that had once housed a thriving business, the lesson was impossible to ignore. In medieval chandlery, Fire was not just a tool to be managed, but a force of destruction that could claim everything. You had built in a matter of minutes, leaving behind only the bitter knowledge that tomorrow you would have to begin again if you survived at all. The winter of 1398 brought London one of its most devastating chandlery disasters, an event that would reshape both public perception of the trade and the regulatory framework governing fire safety in medieval workshops. The conflagration began in the early hours of a February morning in a tallow rendering facility operated by Master William Ashford, a respected member of the Tallow Chandlers' Guild, whose workshop supplied candles to several of the city's largest churches and numerous wealthy households. What started as a routine overnight rendering operation became a catastrophe that consumed an entire city block and claimed 17 lives, including women and children who had no connection to the chandlery trade, but lived in the crowded tenements above and adjacent to the workshop. Contemporary chronicles describe a scene of horror that unfolded with terrifying speed. The fire apparently began when a poorly secured cauldron of molten tallow overturned during the night, spilling its contents across the workshop floor and igniting the wooden structures, stored materials, and accumulated wax residue that had built up over years of operation. The intense heat generated by burning tallow created conditions that rapidly overwhelmed the building's primitive construction, while the narrow streets and tightly packed buildings prevented effective firefighting efforts. The human tragedy of the Ashford fire extended far beyond the immediate casualties. Among the dead were 2 master chandlers from neighboring workshops who had attempted to help fight the blaze, 3 apprentices who had been sleeping in the workshop's upper level, and 12 residents of surrounding buildings who were trapped by the rapid spread of flames through the district's interconnected structures. The survivors faced injuries that would mark them for life, severe burns that left permanent disfigurement, lung damage from smoke inhalation that would compromise their health for years to come, and psychological trauma that affected entire families and neighborhoods. The economic devastation rippled outward from the fire's epicenter, like waves from a stone dropped in still water. The immediate property damage included not just the destroyed workshops, but residential buildings, other businesses, and the accumulated possessions of families who lost everything they owned. The disruption to the local chandlery trade affected candle supplies throughout London, driving up prices and creating shortages that impacted everyone from wealthy merchants to poor laborers who depended on cheap tallow candles for basic illumination. The Guild's response to the Ashford fire revealed both the organization's commitment to member welfare and its limitations in addressing systemic safety problems. Emergency financial assistance was provided to affected members and their families, but the Guild's resources were insufficient to cover the scale of losses involved. The investigation that followed identified numerous safety violations and procedural failures, but it also exposed the economic pressures that had driven even respected masters to accept dangerous working conditions. The legal proceedings that followed the fire created precedents that would influence chandlery regulation for generations. Master Ashford, who survived the fire but lost his workshop and livelihood, faced both civil liability for the damages caused and criminal charges related to the deaths that resulted from his workshop's safety failures. The Guild's attempts to protect him from the harshest penalties created political conflicts with city authorities who were under pressure from citizens demanding accountability for the disaster. The city's regulatory response included new ordinances that attempted to address the fire safety issues revealed by the investigation. Workshops were required to maintain minimum distances from residential buildings, implement improved ventilation systems, and provide better training for apprentices in fire management procedures. The enforcement of these new regulations proved difficult and expensive, creating additional financial burdens for masters who were already struggling with the economic challenges of their trade. The social impact of the fire extended far beyond the immediate neighborhood affected by the flames. Public opinion, already suspicious of chandlery operations due to their smell and mess, turned sharply against the trade as details of the safety violations and preventable nature of the disaster became known. Neighborhoods throughout London began organizing to exclude chandlery operations from residential areas, creating political pressure that would eventually lead to the geographic segregation of fire-prone industries. The technical lessons learned from the Ashford fire influenced workshop design and operating procedures throughout the chandlery trade. The investigation revealed that the overturning cauldron had been inadequately secured, that ventilation systems had been blocked by accumulated debris, and that escape routes had been obstructed by stored materials. These findings led to new guild requirements for equipment installation, workshop layout, and safety procedures that were more comprehensive than anything previously attempted. The psychological impact on chandlery workers extended far beyond those directly affected by the fire. Masters throughout London found themselves questioning the safety of their own operations, implementing costly improvements that strained their already modest profit margins. Apprentices and journeymen demanded better working conditions and safety training, creating labor disputes that further complicated the trade's efforts to recover from the disaster's impact. The religious interpretation of the fire reflected medieval attitudes toward disaster and divine judgment that influenced both individual and community responses. Some clergy interpreted the tragedy as punishment for the sins of the chandlery trade, while others saw it as a test of Christian charity that called for increased support for the victims and their families. These religious perspectives influenced both the legal proceedings and the social responses that shaped the trade's future development. The insurance and compensation mechanisms available to fire victims proved woefully inadequate for addressing the scale of losses involved. Guild charitable funds were quickly exhausted, while the legal processes for determining liability and collecting damages dragged on for years without providing meaningful relief to those who had lost everything. The families of the dead received minimal compensation, while the injured faced medical expenses and lost income that could drive them into permanent poverty. The competitive effects of the fire created opportunities for some chandlers while destroying others. Masters whose workshops survived intact found themselves serving customers whose previous suppliers had been eliminated, potentially increasing their market share and profits. However, the general decline in public acceptance of chandlery operations and the increased regulatory burdens affected the entire trade's profitability and social standing. The technological responses to the fire included innovations in workshop design, equipment construction, and fire suppression that represented genuine advances in safety technology. New cauldron designs incorporated better securing mechanisms and safety features that reduced the risk of spills and overturns. Improved ventilation systems better managed heat and smoke while reducing the accumulation of flammable vapors. The political ramifications of the fire influenced urban planning and industrial regulation in ways that extended far beyond the chandlery trade. City authorities began developing more comprehensive approaches to fire safety that addressed building construction, workshop location, and emergency response capabilities. These early regulatory efforts represented pioneering attempts to balance economic development with public safety concerns. The memorial services and commemorative activities that followed the fire created lasting reminders of the human cost of industrial accidents. Churches throughout London held special masses for the victims, while guild organizations established annual observances that honored the dead while reinforcing safety messages for current workers. These memorial activities served both spiritual and practical purposes, providing comfort to the bereaved while maintaining awareness of fire risks. The international impact of the fire influenced chandlery regulation and safety practices throughout Europe as news of the disaster spread through trade networks and professional organizations. Other cities with significant chandlery operations implemented preventive measures based on the lessons learned from London's tragedy, while guild organizations shared information about safety procedures and regulatory approaches. The long-term effects of the fire continued to influence the chandlery trade for decades after the immediate crisis had passed. Property values in areas with chandlery operations remained depressed, making it difficult for masters to relocate or expand their businesses. The social stigma attached to the trade intensified, affecting recruitment of apprentices and the marriage prospects of chandlers' children. The documentary evidence preserved from the fire investigation provides modern historians with unprecedented insight into medieval industrial safety, urban planning, and social responses to disaster. The detailed records of witness testimony, property damage assessments, and regulatory changes offer a comprehensive picture of how medieval society attempted to balance economic necessity with public safety concerns. As the smoke finally cleared from the ruins of the Ashford workshop and the surrounding buildings, the chandlery trade faced a fundamental question about its future: whether the essential human need for artificial light could justify the continuing risks that their craft posed to both practitioners and the broader community. The answer would shape not only the technical evolution of candlemaking, but the social and economic context within which medieval craftsmen pursued their dangerous trade. In the complex web of medieval urban economics, the price of a single candle represented far more than a simple commercial transaction. It embodied the intersection of labor, raw materials, social hierarchy, and humanity's fundamental struggle against darkness. When a pound of tallow candles cost 1.5 to 2.5 pence in 14th century London, and a skilled labourer earned approximately 3 pence per day, the purchase of adequate lighting represented a significant household expense that required careful budgeting and often painful choices between illumination and other necessities. The mathematical realities of medieval lighting costs created a complex calculus of survival that shaped daily life in ways modern people can barely comprehend. A labourer earning 3 pence daily who spent 2 pence on a pound of candles was dedicating 2/3 of his day's wages to light alone. For a family requiring several pounds of candles per week during the dark winter months, lighting expenses could consume more than half of their total income, leaving insufficient resources for food, clothing, fuel, and shelter. This economic pressure forced most medieval families to ration their use of artificial light carefully, going to bed shortly after sunset and rising before dawn to maximize productive hours during daylight. The pricing structure of medieval candles reflected both the technical challenges of production and the economic relationships that governed craft industries. Tallow candles made from rendered animal fat represented the economy option at 1.5 pence per pound, while superior beeswax candles commanded premium prices of 6.5 pence per pound or more. This price differential created a clear social hierarchy of illumination. The wealthy could afford clean-burning, sweet-smelling beeswax candles that provided steady light without excessive smoke or dripping, while the poor made do with smoky, malodorous tallow candles that burned unevenly and required constant attention. The raw material costs that determined candle prices revealed the complex supply chains that connected medieval crafts to agricultural and trading systems. Tallow suppliers, primarily butchers who sold rendered fat as a byproduct of meat processing, could influence chandler profits through their pricing and quality decisions. Poor quality tallow mixed with cheaper fats or impurities would produce inferior candles that burned poorly and reflected badly on the chandler's reputation. High-quality tallow commanded premium prices that squeezed chandler profit margins while ensuring customer satisfaction. The seasonal fluctuations in candle demand created economic patterns that shaped both production strategies and household budgeting throughout the medieval calendar. Winter months brought peak demand as shortened daylight hours forced greater reliance on artificial illumination, but they also coincided with periods when many laborers faced reduced work opportunities and income. The economic pressure of high lighting costs during winter often forced families to choose between adequate illumination and sufficient heating, as both required scarce financial resources. The guild system's price regulation created artificial market stability that benefited some participants while constraining others. Fixed pricing for funeral and ceremonial candles, 9 pence per pound for complete service, eliminated price competition while ensuring predictable income for guild members. However, this price stability came at the cost of reduced market flexibility and innovation, as chandlers could not adjust prices to reflect changing costs or market conditions without guild approval. The credit and payment systems that developed around candle sales reflected both the essential nature of lighting and the economic constraints faced by medieval customers. Many chandlers extended credit to regular customers, particularly during winter months, when demand peaked but customer resources were stretched thin. These credit arrangements created ongoing relationships that went beyond simple commercial transactions, embedding chandlers in networks of mutual obligation and dependency that could provide economic security but also created vulnerabilities when customers defaulted on their debts. The institutional markets for candles, churches, guilds, wealthy households, and municipal governments provided steady demand that could sustain chandler businesses, but they also created dependencies that could be economically dangerous. Large contracts for ceremonial or institutional lighting offered attractive revenue opportunities, but they often required substantial upfront investments in materials and labor that could strain small operations. The loss of a major institutional customer could threaten a chandler's financial survival. The competition between different types of chandlers created market segmentation that reflected broader social and economic hierarchies. Wax chandlers served wealthy customers who could afford premium products, while tallow chandlers competed for mass-market customers who prioritized price over quality. This market division created different economic pressures and opportunities for each segment of the trade, influencing everything from workshop investment strategies to political alliances within the guild system. The export and import dimensions of the candle trade connected local chandlers to broader European commercial networks that could provide opportunities, but also created vulnerabilities. Imported beeswax from various European sources allowed wax chandlers to serve luxury markets, but supply disruptions due to war, weather, or political conflicts could threaten their operations. Similarly, English candles found markets in other European cities, creating export opportunities that could supplement local sales. The taxation and regulation of candle sales reflected both the trade's economic importance and the government's need for revenue. Municipal authorities imposed various fees and taxes on chandler operations, from workshop licenses to sales taxes that added to the cost burden faced by both producers and consumers. Guild dues and assessments created additional overhead costs that had to be recovered through pricing, while regulatory compliance required investments in equipment and procedures that might not directly contribute to production efficiency. The relationship between lighting costs and social mobility illustrated how basic necessities could either enable or constrain economic advancement. Families that could afford adequate lighting could extend productive hours for activities like textile work, reading, or craft production that might supplement their income. Conversely, families forced to ration lighting severely found their economic opportunities constrained by the practical limitations of working only during daylight hours. The economic calculations that governed household lighting decisions revealed the complex trade-offs that defined medieval domestic life. A family might choose to purchase fewer but higher quality candles that burned longer and more efficiently, or they might buy more numerous cheaper candles that provided less satisfactory illumination but offered greater flexibility in usage patterns. These choices reflected not just economic constraints, but cultural values about the relative importance of comfort, efficiency, and social status. The insurance and risk management mechanisms available to chandlers were primitive compared to modern standards, but they reflected innovative approaches to managing the financial uncertainties inherent in craft production. Guild mutual aid systems provided some protection against fire damage or other disasters, while informal networks of fellow craftsmen could offer temporary assistance during difficult periods. However, these mechanisms were often inadequate for addressing major losses or extended periods of economic difficulty. The labor costs associated with candle production reflected both the skill requirements of the trade and the broader patterns of medieval wage labor. Skilled masters could command higher prices for their products, but they also faced higher labor costs for experienced journeymen and the long-term investment required to train apprentices properly. The economic balance between labor quality and cost efficiency required careful management that influenced both production methods and business strategies. The capital requirements for establishing and maintaining a chandlery operation created barriers to entry that shaped the social composition of the trade. Aspiring masters needed sufficient resources to purchase equipment, secure workshop space, maintain inventory, and support themselves during the establishment period when customer bases were being developed. These capital requirements often meant that success in chandlery required either family resources or access to credit that was unavailable to the poorest segments of society. The economic relationships between chandlers and other crafts created networks of mutual dependency that could provide stability but also transmitted economic shocks throughout related industries. Butchers who supplied tallow depended on chandlers as customers for their waste products, while chandlers relied on butchers for consistent supplies of raw materials. Disruptions in either trade could affect the economic viability of both, creating interconnected vulnerabilities that required careful management. The pricing strategies available to medieval chandlers were constrained by guild regulations, customer expectations, and competitive pressures that limited their ability to respond flexibly to changing market conditions. Fixed guild pricing eliminated some forms of competition while creating others, as chandlers competed on quality, service, and personal relationships rather than price alone. This competition structure influenced both production methods and customer relationship management in ways that shaped the entire trade's development. As you counted the day's modest earnings and calculated the costs of tomorrow's materials, the economic realities of medieval chandlery presented themselves with unforgiving clarity. In a world where darkness fell early and stayed late, the business of creating light was essential but never easy, profitable but never secure, necessary but never simple. Within the deceptively simple world of medieval candle-making lay a complex social hierarchy that reflected and reinforced broader patterns of economic inequality, political power, and cultural status. At the pinnacle of this hierarchy stood the wealthy wax chandlers who served aristocratic households, religious institutions, and successful merchants, their workshops filled with imported beeswax that commanded prices 6 times higher than common tallow candles. These elite craftsmen enjoyed social standing that approached respectability, their clean-burning, sweet-smelling products associating them with the refined sensibilities of their upscale clientele. The distinction between wax and tallow chandlers represented more than mere specialization in different materials. It embodied fundamental differences in social position, economic opportunity, and daily working conditions. Wax chandlers typically operated in better neighborhoods, served wealthier customers, and commanded higher profit margins that allowed them to invest in superior equipment and working conditions. Their workshops, while still subject to fire hazards and the basic challenges of the trade, were generally cleaner, better ventilated, and more socially acceptable than the malodorous tallow operations that dominated the mass market. The internal hierarchy within each segment of the chandlery trade created additional layers of distinction that shaped individual prospects and daily experiences. Among wax chandlers, those who secured contracts with major religious institutions enjoyed particular prestige and economic security. Churches required substantial quantities of candles for religious ceremonies, and these institutional contracts provided steady income that was less subject to seasonal fluctuations than household sales. Masters who supplied cathedrals or major monasteries could often afford to maintain larger workshops, employ more assistants, and invest in the kind of equipment and techniques that enhanced their professional reputations. Below the institutional, suppliers in the wax chandler hierarchy were those who served wealthy individual households. These chandlers might enjoy less prestige than their ecclesiastical counterparts, but they often developed personal relationships with their customers that provided both economic security and social advancement opportunities. A wax chandler who earned the trust and patronage of a noble household might find opportunities to expand his business, secure favorable credit terms, or even arrange advantageous marriages for his children within the broader network of craftsmen and merchants who served the wealthy. The master craftsmen who dominated guild leadership represented the aristocracy of their respective trades, wielding political power that extended far beyond their workshops. These guild masters typically owned multiple operations, employed numerous journeymen and apprentices, and often diversified their activities into related trades or financial services. Their political influence within the guild system allowed them to shape regulations, pricing policies, and market access in ways that protected their established positions while potentially limiting opportunities for aspiring competitors. The journeymen who formed the middle tier of chandlery hierarchy occupied a particularly complex and often frustrating social position. Having completed their 7-year apprenticeships, they possessed the technical skills needed for independent operation, but lacked the capital, political connections, or market access required to establish their own workshops. Many journeymen spent years or even decades working for wages while attempting to accumulate the resources needed for advancement to master status. The economic barriers to achieving mastership had grown increasingly formidable as the guild system matured and market competition intensified. The capital requirements for establishing a workshop, including equipment, inventory, workspace, and living expenses during the establishment period, often exceeded what journeymen could accumulate through wage labor alone. Guild admission fees, political connections, and access to supplier relationships created additional obstacles that favored those with family resources or patron relationships. Within the journeyman ranks, subtle distinctions of skill, specialization, and employer relationships created their own hierarchies of status and opportunity. Journeymen who worked for prestigious masters gained access to advanced techniques, wealthy customers, and professional networks that could enhance their eventual prospects for independence. Those employed by struggling operations might find their skills underutilized and their advancement opportunities limited by their master's economic constraints. The apprentice system created the foundation level of chandlery hierarchy, but even here, significant variations in treatment and opportunity reflected broader social inequalities. Apprentices from craft families often received better treatment and more comprehensive training than those from agricultural or laboring backgrounds, as masters valued the social connections and cultural knowledge that craft-born apprentices brought to their workshops. The 7-year apprenticeship period could be either genuine preparation for professional advancement or extended exploitation of unpaid labor, depending largely on the master's character and economic circumstances. The gender dimensions of chandlery hierarchy reflected medieval attitudes toward women's work while creating unique opportunities and constraints within the trade. While most chandlers were male, women played important roles as workshop assistants, particularly in family operations, where wives and daughters contributed essential labor. Some women inherited chandlery businesses from deceased husbands or fathers and guild records document female chandlers who achieved considerable success despite the social and legal obstacles they faced. The regional variations in chandlery hierarchy reflected local economic conditions, political structures, and cultural traditions that shaped the trade's development differently in various parts of medieval Europe. London's chandlers enjoyed more political influence and economic opportunity than their counterparts in smaller towns, while those in major commercial centres like Paris or Venice faced different competitive pressures and regulatory environments that influenced their social standing and economic prospects. The relationship between chandlery hierarchy and broader social mobility illustrated both the opportunities and limitations of craft-based advancement in medieval society. Successful chandlers could accumulate sufficient wealth to purchase property, arrange advantageous marriages for their children, or even transition into merchant activities that offered higher social status. However, the social stigma associated with working in malodorous, fire-prone industries created barriers to complete social acceptance that even wealthy chandlers struggled to overcome. The political dimensions of hierarchy within the chandlery trade reflected broader patterns of medieval urban governance and guild organization. Guild leadership positions provided access to municipal politics, trade regulation, and economic policy-making that could benefit both individual interests and the trade's collective welfare. However, these leadership opportunities were typically monopolized by the wealthiest and most politically connected masters, creating resentment among rank-and-file members who bore the costs of guild activities while enjoying limited influence. Over guild policies, the economic relationships between different levels of the chandlery hierarchy created both cooperative and competitive dynamics that shaped daily interactions within the trade. Masters depended on skilled journeymen and reliable apprentices for productive operations, while workers needed access to employment, training, and advancement opportunities that only established masters could provide. These mutual dependencies created incentives for cooperation, but they also generated tensions over wages, working conditions, and promotional opportunities. The educational and cultural capital required for advancement within chandlery hierarchy extended far beyond technical skill in candle making. Successful masters needed literacy for maintaining business records, numeracy for managing complex financial transactions, and social skills for developing customer relationships and navigating guild politics. The acquisition of these capabilities often required advantages of birth, education, or social connection that were unavailable to workers from humble backgrounds. The consumption patterns that reinforced chandlery hierarchy created market segmentation that influenced both production strategies and social relationships within the trade. Wealthy customers who purchased expensive beeswax candles expected superior service, custom products, and personal relationships with their suppliers that required social skills and cultural knowledge beyond mere technical competence. Poor customers who bought cheap tallow candles in small quantities created different demands that emphasized price efficiency and volume production over personal service. The inheritance patterns that governed the transfer of chandlery businesses between generations reflected both the opportunities and limitations of family-based craft enterprises. Successful masters could pass workshops, customer relationships, and guild memberships to their sons, providing advantages that were unavailable to workers without family connections in the trade. However, inheritance also created obligations and constraints that could limit flexibility in adapting to changing market conditions or pursuing alternative opportunities. The credit and financial relationships that sustained chandlery operations often reflected and reinforced existing hierarchies within the trade. Wealthy masters could extend credit to customers and suppliers, creating dependency relationships that enhanced their market power while generating additional income through interest charges. Poor masters and journeymen often found themselves dependent on credit from wealthier colleagues or outside financiers, creating obligations that could limit their independence and economic advancement. The technological innovation within the Chandlery trade was often driven by competitive pressures between different levels of the hierarchy, as masters sought advantages that would distinguish their products and justify premium pricing. Improvements in candle quality, burning characteristics, or production efficiency could provide competitive advantages that enhanced a master's reputation and market position, but they also required investments in equipment, training, and materials that were often available only to those with substantial resources. As the hierarchy of flame cast its shadows across medieval chandlery, the fundamental question remained whether the social and economic stratification that characterized the trade represented natural market outcomes or artificial barriers that limited human potential and economic efficiency. The daily reality of survival as a medieval chandler meant carrying a weight that extended far beyond the physical burden of hauling tallow, feeding fires, and dipping endless rows of candles. It was the psychological weight of knowing that your livelihood depended on a trade that society simultaneously needed and despised, the economic weight of margins so thin that a single bad batch of raw materials could threaten your family's security, and the social weight of occupying a position that marked you as both essential and undesirable in your community's complex hierarchy of respectability. When a master carpenter could earn 3 to 4 pence per day, while you sold candles for 1.5 to 2.5 pence per pound, with materials, labor, and overhead consuming most of that revenue, the mathematics of chandlery survival required a level of financial discipline that left no room for error or extravagance. Every expenditure had to be weighed against immediate necessity, every business decision evaluated for its impact on the narrow margin between subsistence and disaster. The constant pressure of these calculations shaped not just your professional choices, but your entire approach to life, creating habits of extreme frugality and risk aversion that could persist long after economic circumstances improved. The seasonal rhythm of survival in the chandlery trade created patterns of feast and famine that tested both financial planning skills and psychological resilience. Winter brought increased demand for candles as daylight hours shortened, but it also brought higher costs for fuel, raw materials, and the extended working hours needed to meet customer demand. The economic pressures of winter production often required working 16-hour days in harsh conditions while investing heavily in inventory and materials that might not generate income for weeks or months. Spring and summer brought relief from intensive production schedules, but also created cash flow challenges as demand dropped and customers who had purchased on credit during winter months struggled to pay their debts. The cyclical nature of chandlery income required maintaining reserves during profitable periods to survive the lean months, a financial discipline that was difficult to maintain when immediate needs pressed heavily on limited resources. The health costs of chandlery work created ongoing financial and personal burdens that compounded the challenges of economic survival. The constant exposure to smoke, heat, and chemical fumes took a cumulative toll on respiratory health, while the physical demands of the work caused joint problems, back injuries, and repetitive stress conditions that could limit productivity and working lifespan. In an era without health insurance or disability benefits, work-related health problems threatened not just immediate income, but long-term survival prospects. The social isolation that accompanied chandlery work created psychological pressures that could be as debilitating as economic hardship. The offensive odors and fire hazards associated with the trade made chandlers unwelcome neighbors in respectable districts, while the social stigma attached to working in such conditions limited opportunities for social advancement and community integration. This isolation could lead to depression, alcoholism, and other coping mechanisms that further undermined both health and economic prospects. The family relationships strained by chandlery work reflected the broader social costs of pursuing a necessary but undesirable trade. Wives and children of chandlers often bore secondary stigma that affected their own social opportunities, while the demands of the work schedule limited time available for family relationships and community participation. The economic pressures of the trade sometimes required involving family members in workshop operations, exposing them to the same health risks and social stigma that affected the primary worker. The apprenticeship obligations that provided future labor also created immediate financial burdens that complicated survival calculations. Masters were required to provide food, lodging, clothing, and training for their apprentices throughout the 7-year training period, representing a substantial, ongoing expense that had to be balanced against the value of their labor contributions. Poor masters might find themselves unable to provide adequate support for apprentices, leading to contract violations that could result in guild penalties or legal problems. The equipment maintenance and replacement costs that were essential for continued operation required ongoing capital investments that competed with immediate survival needs. Cauldrons, dipping frames, and other specialized equipment were expensive to purchase and maintain, while wear, accidents, and occasional fires could require sudden expenditures that strained limited resources. The temptation to defer maintenance or continue using worn equipment created safety hazards that could threaten both immediate survival and long-term viability. The debt relationships that often sustained chandlery operations during difficult periods created ongoing obligations that could constrain business decisions and limit flexibility. Credit from suppliers, customers, or money lenders might be essential for surviving seasonal fluctuations or equipment failures, but the interest charges and repayment obligations could consume profits for years and create vulnerabilities. 2. Economic pressure from creditors. The competition within the chandlery trade intensified survival pressures by limiting opportunities for price increases or market expansion. Guild price regulations prevented competitive pricing strategies, while the limited market for candles meant that success often came at the expense of other chandlers rather than through overall market growth. This zero-sum competition created tensions within guild communities and discouraged innovation or investment that might benefit the trade as a whole. The political obligations of guild membership added another layer of cost and complexity to survival calculations. Guild dues, assessments, and ceremonial expenses were mandatory for maintaining professional standing, while participation in guild politics required time and social skills that diverted energy from production activities. Masters who failed to meet guild obligations faced penalties that could threaten their professional survival, while those who participated actively often found the costs exceeded the benefits. The regulatory compliance requirements imposed by both guild and municipal authorities created ongoing expenses and operational constraints that complicated business planning. Workshop safety regulations, quality standards, and trade restrictions required investments in equipment and procedures that might not directly contribute to productivity or profitability, while violations could result in fines, product confiscation, or loss of trading privileges that threatened immediate survival. The insurance and risk management options available to medieval chandlers were limited and often inadequate for addressing the major threats to business survival. Guild mutual aid systems provided some protection against fire damage or other disasters, but the resources available were typically insufficient to cover major losses or extended periods of economic difficulty. The lack of effective insurance mechanisms meant that chandlers bore the full risk of accidents, market fluctuations, and other threats to their operations. The retirement and old age security prospects for chandlers were limited by the physical demands of the trade and the modest income it provided. Few chandlers could accumulate sufficient savings to support themselves in old age without continued work, while the health effects of decades of exposure to smoke and chemicals often made continued work impossible. Many elderly chandlers found themselves dependent on family support or guild charity that might be inadequate for basic survival needs. The geographic mobility constraints faced by chandlers limited their ability to respond to local economic changes or seek better opportunities elsewhere. Guild membership and customer relationships were typically tied to specific locations, while the specialized equipment and supplier relationships required for chandlery operations made relocation expensive and risky. Chandlers who faced local economic difficulties often had few options for escaping their circumstances. The educational limitations that characterized many chandlers restricted their ability to adapt to changing market conditions or pursue alternative opportunities. Limited literacy and numeracy skills made it difficult to maintain complex business records, analyze market trends, or develop sophisticated business strategies. These educational constraints perpetuated economic vulnerability and limited opportunities for advancement beyond basic survival. The technological changes beginning to emerge in the late medieval period created both opportunities and threats for traditional chandlery operations. New materials, improved production techniques, and changing customer preferences required adaptations that some chandlers could not afford or implement, while those who successfully adopted innovations often gained competitive advantages that threatened their traditionalist colleagues. The weather and environmental factors that affected chandlery operations created additional uncertainties that complicated survival planning. Wet weather could disrupt fuel supplies and affect candle drying processes, while extreme temperatures could make workshop conditions unbearable or dangerous. Climate variations that affected agricultural production could influence the availability and cost of raw materials, creating price fluctuations that chandlers had to absorb with their limited profit margins. The legal and judicial systems that governed medieval commerce provided some protection for chandlers' rights, but also created obligations and vulnerabilities that affected survival prospects. Contract disputes, debt collection procedures, and criminal charges related to fire accidents could result in legal expenses, fines, or imprisonment that threatened both immediate survival and long-term prospects. The complexity of medieval law and the costs of legal representation often disadvantaged chandlers in disputes with wealthier opponents. The cultural and religious attitudes that shaped medieval society's view of commercial activities created additional pressures for chandlers seeking both economic success and social acceptance. Religious teachings about usury, fair pricing, and honest dealing created moral obligations that could conflict with economic necessity, while social expectations about appropriate behavior for craftsmen limited the strategies available for business advancement. The marriage and family formation decisions that chandlers faced were constrained by their economic circumstances and social position in ways that could perpetuate cycles of limited opportunity. The modest income provided by chandlery made it difficult to attract marriage partners from higher social classes, while the health risks and social stigma associated with the trade could limit options even within appropriate social levels. These constraints often meant that chandlers' children faced similar limitations in their opportunities for social and economic advancement. The estate planning and inheritance challenges faced by chandlers reflected both the modest value of their assets and the specific requirements of craft-based businesses. Workshop equipment, customer relationships, and guild memberships required specialized knowledge to maintain value, while the ongoing obligations of apprenticeship contracts and debt relationships could complicate inheritance transfers. Many chandlers found it difficult to provide their children with advantages that would enable escape from the trade's limitations. The community relationships that sustained chandlers through difficult periods also created obligations and expectations that could burden survival efforts. Neighborhood networks, religious affiliations, and family connections provided social support and economic assistance during emergencies, but they also created expectations for reciprocal aid that could strain limited resources. The balance between community engagement and economic self-protection required careful management that added complexity to already difficult survival calculations. The psychological resilience required for long-term survival in chandlery demanded coping mechanisms that could maintain motivation and hope despite ongoing hardships. The repetitive nature of the work, combined with social isolation and economic stress, created conditions that could lead to depression, despair, or destructive behaviors that further undermined survival prospects. Successful chandlers often developed philosophical or religious frameworks that provided meaning and purpose beyond immediate material concerns. The entrepreneurial opportunities that existed within the constraints of medieval chandlery required creativity, risk tolerance, and access to resources that were often beyond the reach of survival-focused operations. Successful expansion into related trades, development of specialized products, or establishment of multiple workshops demanded capital investments and business skills that could provide pathways beyond basic survival, but these opportunities were available primarily to those who had already achieved a measure of economic security. As you banked the fires of another long day and counted the modest coins that represented your family's survival for one more week, the weight of your circumstances pressed down with the accumulated force of countless similar evenings. The knowledge that tomorrow would bring the same challenges, the same risks, and the same narrow margin between success and disaster created a burden that was perhaps heavier than any physical load you carried in your workshop. Yet, somehow, like countless generations of chandlers before and after you, you found the strength to continue, driven by the fundamental human refusal to surrender in the face of overwhelming odds. The weight of survival in medieval chandlery was ultimately the weight of human dignity maintained against circumstances that seemed designed to crush it. The weight of hope preserved despite evidence that suggested despair might be more rational, and the weight of responsibility to family and community that demanded perseverance, regardless of personal cost. In carrying this weight, medieval chandlers bore not just their own burdens, but the burden of illuminating a world that desperately needed light, even when it could barely afford the cost of creating it.